All right, well, John chapter 9, we're up to the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. I suppose the first question that comes out of this little bit, which I'll read, is that whole question of the Jewish understanding, or maybe it was a general understanding that if someone was born or came into the world with some sort of ailment, then there must have been some kind of sin or problem with them. Anyway, I'll read this first bit. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sins or his parents' sins? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. This happened so the power of God could be seen in him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who sent us. The night is coming and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, I am the light of the world. And then he spit on the ground, made mud, spread it on the man's eyes, tell him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And he went and washed and he could see. So my understanding is that it was fairly generally accepted that if you had something wrong with you, then it was a result of sin.
Yeah. And actually, Jesus, remember in chapter 5, he John tells the story of the cripple that was at the pool of Bethesda.
Yeah.
And after Jesus had healed him, and the bloke had picked up his bed and gone home and got into trouble with the Pharisees for breaking the Sabbath law, it says, Jesus found him and said, don't sin anymore or worse will happen to you. So that's sort of reinforcing the idea that everything that goes wrong in the world is God's punishing you for sin.
There is a whole lot of stuff that goes wrong in the world that is because of sin.
Yeah.
You make poor choices and, there's consequences of those things that just happen the way we are physically.
Exactly.
If you smoke all your life, then you might get lung cancer.
And more chance of getting lung cancer.
Yeah. But you might not.
The lie to it, I think, is that there are people who don't smoke a cigarette in their whole lives and they get lung cancer too. So there's not a straight correlation between sin and sickness.
Yeah.
It seems to me, just the facts of the case. So we put on it the idea that when we have something go wrong, that it's God punishing us for sin. We superimpose that upon just the ups and downs of life.
Yeah.
The chances that you take by being part of the world. Yeah.
But is that ever the case, though?
Well, obviously not.
Does God punish us for sin?
I think.
Do we face the consequences of our own choices?
I think at the very least you have to say God lets us experience the consequences of our sin.
Yeah.
Although sometimes he lets people off.
Yeah.
They lived a life of debauchery and they should suffer for it, but they don't. And in fact, there's a psalm, I think it's Psalm 70, where it says how the psalmist really got into a bad mood because he was looking around and he saw people who were sinful, who were prospering, rolling in fat. And his solution in that psalm was that then he went up to the temple and got the big picture, recognized and realized that, well, this life it doesn't really count in the big scale of things, and what happens here is almost inconsequential. But the big issue is how you're going to spend eternity, I suppose.
Yeah.
The way it's said.
What about the idea that you might have some sort of ailment because of the sin of your parents? That the sin of the fathers being heaped upon the sons until however many generations.
Fourth generation, I think. Yeah.
Fourth generation.
I do believe that was a discussion amongst the Jews that if somebody was born blind like this man, and they already had in their mind that most likely it was because he sinned, how the heck did he sin before he was born? And they did have they had a few answers. One was that souls actually were alive before they were born, and it was possible to sin before you were born. Then the other one, that you inherited sin. Like, I think there was one of the rabbis who said that a woman who was pregnant, if she broke the Sabbath law, then the child in her womb had also broken the Sabbath law. So, but they had a problem with it, same as we do. There's no clear answer. But Jesus' answer was very clear in this case. It had nothing to do with sin, either the man's or his parents, that there was a purpose in it. And I think that's the exciting thing. What did he say? It's neither that this man or his parents sinned, replied Jesus, but he was born blind so that the power of God might be displayed in curing him.
So Jesus' response there, do we then generalize and apply that to every kind of ailment?
Well, I think we're invited to. If you put a blank, this person was blank so that the power of God may be displayed in blank. And I think we can say for sure that that's true, that God has a purpose and it's behind everything that happens in the world. The Jews, I was just reading a psalm last night, Psalm 104, and the bloke who wrote that psalm was delighted as he looked at all the details of life in this world, the ocean full of fish and the seasons that came and the rain and the grass that grew to feed the animals, and even the nature red in tooth and claw, the hunters getting their fill through the night, and man just being a part of the whole scheme of things. And I think they used to see like every detail as somehow or other linked to God's purpose. This is the way God wants it. And ultimately, he's got a blessing in store that we only get glimpses of a future kind of event, bringing about of the fulfillment of every hope and every dream and that sort of thing, including his own, which is to bless. So if you can, I don't think I can, but if you could stretch your mind big enough to see things from that perspective, then of course you'd have to say that everything that went wrong has a bigger purpose, as it was in this man's case, and it gave Jesus the opportunity to show the power of God in healing him, and also it was a symbol. It was an illustration of his claim to be the light of the world, that as light of world he could give people sight. So, but if I had an accident and became a paraplegic, I know it would be one huge struggle for me to put that in that bigger perspective and to say, Laurie had an accident and became a paraplegic so that the power of God may be displayed in showing how God can help him adjust and still have the joy of salvation, or something rather like that.
Yeah, but I mean, we do see, we see examples and stories where that happened. That has happened, and people have been able to find joy even in great suffering.
Yeah.
But I mean, sometimes the suffering is huge.
And somehow or other, it seems like it's whether it's the power of God is more available when there's a huge crisis and human beings respond to it, or not, I don't know. But it seems like it's easier to adjust to huge suffering than it is to hammering your fingernail with the hammer when you're fixing something outside.
Yeah. Well, I suppose at the heart of it is that sort of question that's been asked for a long time about how can there be an all-powerful good God, yet there's suffering and pain. And obviously it's pretty closely linked to the way we've been made to have freedom. Freedom brings the possibility of relationship and love, but also the possibility of making a mess.
Yeah, and I think it just underlines again that we rebelled against our Creator. The human race rebelled, and that the world has become different from what God dreamed of it to be. And as a result, things go wrong. In fact, the story in Genesis about Adam and Eve disobeying about the fruit in the garden, God said that one of the punishments for man was that he would have to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, that the earth was going to bring forth thistles and weeds against him, and that life became hard because we chose to live independent of God. That's the long and the short of it. And for women, trouble in childbirth. So, yeah, I think, there's no question that the suffering in the world, it's not God's will, it's not his purpose, but he makes use of it for fulfilling his deeper purpose, his bigger desire to bring ultimate blessing to the creation that he made.
Yep. And in this case, it's firstly, it points to who he is, because he gives sight to a blind man who's been born blind, not just blind partway through his life. And then also, it points to who Jesus is and gives glory to God. And they're the main things that come out of this, do you think?
There's another thing that struck me when Jesus said, after he said he was born blind that God's power might be displayed in healing him, and then he said, we must work the works of him who sent me. While daylight lasts, we must work the works, or do the works of him who sent me. Night comes when no one can work. And I think there's a highlighting there again that we really do live in critical days, we human beings here on earth, while we're living in a rebellion against our Creator, that it's not going to last forever. And God has worked out of his love and his kindness to do good things and give us this way of salvation through Jesus Christ, but it's not going to last forever. Daylight has a period, and that statement from Jesus, we must do the works of him who sent me. While daylight lasts, we must do the work of him who sent me. And it kind of jolted me to think that Jesus knew that his time was short on earth, and he has also given responsibility for the work that he came to do to us, his followers. and we must do the work of God.
Later on, he says, "You'll do even greater things than I've done."
Yeah, yeah. So that puts a heavy emphasis on our response, our responsibility to see the big picture and then to live it here in such a way that we are free to, that we show the truth of it. And that kind of gives us an authority. Well, we've got the authority to speak the truth of it too, to warn people that there is a God and that this God is kind and that he's done something to get over the rebellion, the sin that has made life in many ways miserable for the human race, and that he offers us this salvation. And this salvation comes to us almost like sight must have come to that man. I wonder how old he was, but
Yeah,
an awful long time to be blind and make your living by begging, finding your way around by in the dark.
yeah,
It makes a very, very good analogy, I think, of the human race now, separated from God by our own rebellion, by our sin, and needing a work of God to take place to restore our sight.
yeah.
Yeah.
And even probably the significance of being born blind in a way, that
Yeah.
there is there's something where even from the start, there's a blindness towards God.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. We don't grow up naturally being godly. It's a
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah. So Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud with saliva, and puts it on the man's eyes. Seems to be different ways that he heals. Sometimes he just
Spits.
touches a person.
Yeah.
I love the one where he heals the man with who couldn't speak and also was deaf and couldn't speak.
Yeah.
Touches his tongue and then puts his fingers in his ears.
Yeah.
That's a good one because he's obviously communicating with that man in a way that he could connect with and understand.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, he wouldn't have had a clue what was happening to him if he was deaf. I guess from seeing, you might be able to see. But here, any significance of the mud and the spit? Not very COVID safe.
I don't think so, except, apparently that was regarded, one of the emperors, I think it was Vespasian, was asked to spit on somebody to heal them. There was all kinds of, what would you call it, superstitions really, about the power of the spit of a powerful person, but I don't think there was any healing benefit in the mud. I think that the mud was just a means of communicating that the power is going from Jesus to this man's eyes in order to heal him.
And then the call for the man to go and wash in the pool. I suppose I keep asking the same kind of questions. Any significance in the pool?
Yeah,
So
well,
being sent, or
it seems like John's trying to get a message across, like Siloam means sent.
yeah,
And,
he does. He mentions that deliberately.
yeah, and he does it often, he translates things into Greek from the Aramaic or the Hebrew words, or explains things. So he knew that he was writing to Gentiles. But what struck me there was that the man had to do something on his part,
Yeah,
that he had to make an effort. And I had this feeling, I wondered how many people had spat on his eyes or made mud on the ground and put them on his eyes, or given him fruit to eat or something to drink and said, "Here, this is going to heal you," because there'd be all kinds of people who would want to try out their cures on him.
Yeah.
And, yeah. And I wondered, if he was tempted to think, oh, no, not another one.
Yeah.
Uh,
Do we have any idea where Jesus is at this time? Is he still at the temple, or has he moved?
yeah, it's amazing, I was following it through the other day. In chapter 1, he's with John the Baptist, and that's in Judea, but not in Jerusalem. And there's the baptism, and then the call of his first disciples, at least. And then it says Passover was near, so he goes down to Jerusalem in. Is at the start of chapter 2, I think, and it's in there in Jerusalem that he causes a fuss down at the temple by interrupting the commercial side of the business.
Yeah.
Made a lot of enemies, and then again he went out in chapter 3. He has this meeting with Nicodemus and talks about the need for a spiritual rebirth.
Yep. Chapter 4, he goes up to Samaria.
Well, at the end of chapter 3, he leaves Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem for the Passover, and while Nicodemus is there, and then he goes back to where John was baptizing, and there's an interaction between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples there, again in Judea, until he hears that the Pharisees are paying attention to him, and that's when he goes back up to Galilee and goes through Samaria and talks about the water of life with the Samaritan woman. That's in chapter 4. And
then 5, he's back at the pool of Bethesda.
yeah,
In Jerusalem.
yeah. And in chapter 6, without telling us exactly about his travel movements, it's got Jesus. In chapter 5, he's back in Jerusalem, and that starts a big argument, big discussion, and he makes claims about himself, and that people have to honor him as they honor the Father, and that he and the Father were one, and
Yeah.
huge things about his identity. And at the end of that chapter 5, he, for the first time, really attacks the Pharisees and tells them, look, you're biblical, all right. You think that you're going to be saved just because you believe the Bible, which was the Old Testament, but you don't really understand it. If you really understood it, you'd see who I really am and you'd come to me. So, and then it jumps from there, and he's in chapter 6, he's in Galilee feeding the 5,000, and in Capernaum at the synagogue talking about the bread of life. And then chapter 7 is where his brothers get to him up in Galilee and said, because it was the Feast of Tabernacles coming up, and his brothers are saying, if you're really going to, claim to make all these claims, being up here in Galilee isn't going to do you much good. You should get down there into Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And he said he wasn't going to go. Well, he said he wasn't going to go yet. And then after his brothers had gone, he went there. And so chapter 7, you have him in the middle of the festival claiming to be, to give, water of life, really, again.
Yep.
And then in chapter 8, he's still there, and he's claiming to be the light of the world, again in Jerusalem in the temple. And then in chapter 9, he heals this man. And in chapter 10, I think 9 and 10 run on together. I think there's a really significant thing happens there in chapter 9. I mean, it's a bit of a relief, because like most of the time, it's been fairly argumentative type of discussions between the Pharisees and the Jews and Jesus. But here's Jesus doesn't do very much. Well, I suppose he heals the bloke, but
Yeah.
he heals him and then leaves the fellow to go through the whole trauma of facing up to the Pharisees and being cross-examined. But
Yeah.
at the end of the chapter, Jesus comes to him, and I think it's the first time I think that Jesus seems to, apart from his disciples right at the beginning, but this is where he's calling people into a fellowship with him.
Mm.
And it's probably where the church really starts, over against Israel and the temple and the Old Testament. That here at the end of this episode with the blind man, the church actually starts in a personal relationship with Jesus, which is what he talks about in chapter 10 when he talks about being the shepherd of the sheep. And that also seems to be in Jerusalem, so that from chapter 7 through 8, 9, and 10, it's all the Feast of Tabernacles with Jesus coming sort of incognito, then revealing himself. And a couple of times John says, and it's amazing that he was up in the temple teaching and nobody arrested him.
Yeah.
The Jews were out for his blood, but they probably didn't have all the evidence ready. They hadn't set the scene properly because they really wanted him dead. And to do that, they had to get the permission from Pilate, the Roman governor. So I think they're working towards that end. And in chapter 10, after the Feast of Tabernacles, a couple of months later was the Feast of Dedication in the temple. And and Jesus is there still in Jerusalem and has, I think, a final discussion with, final attempt to persuade the Jews that their best bet was to accept him and follow him
Yeah.
at Feast of Dedication. And then he had to leave Jerusalem because they were after him.
Yeah.
And he goes off into Judea, not back up into Galilee. And he comes back
Because of Lazarus.
to heal Lazarus, but he still has to go to some kind of a safe house after that.
Yeah.
And doesn't come back and it's in Judea, I think, and he doesn't come back into Jerusalem then until the Passover.
So coming back to this chapter, it's interesting, the conversations the investigation that happens with the Pharisees and the blind man. Obviously there's controversy because Jesus healed, made mud, healed, and then told him to go and wash all on the Sabbath, which were considered illegal. And so the Pharisees investigate. And I get the feeling like the conversations that the Pharisees have with this man are a little bit like the conversations they have with Jesus. That it's plain what's happened, and they're sort of going backwards and forwards, and the blind man, or the man born blind, points out the truth of what's happened, and it's right there in front of them, but yet the Pharisees still refuse to believe. There's some pretty interesting bits in the conversation.
I love it. It's just so fantastic to see this blind man that they despised, but he was prime evidence right in front of their noses. They couldn't ignore it.
Yeah.
And just that statement when he was taken to the Pharisees, and it says, some of them said, "This man cannot be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath."
Yeah.
Others of them, to get the balance, others of them said, if he didn't come from God, how could he do such a sign like this? So
that's right.
they were confused, but it seems like usually happens, I think, the negative people always win. And that's just that. I wonder how many times we have put down somebody, he can't be a man of God, he doesn't keep the Sabbath. What we mean is when he doesn't jump through our hoops, when he doesn't do what we think he should do.
Yeah.
We kind of assume that we've got the final say about who is right with God and who isn't. I think we still do, you know. Got a brother like that a bit. If you don't think exactly as he thinks and do what he does as a Christian, then a big question mark about your faith, whether you really belong to God or not.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So what's the better, more healthy perspective?
Well, I think it's if you argue against God, you're going to lose. Eventually, you're going to lose. I think somewhere at the end of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he said, we can do nothing against the truth. We can only support the truth. And I think the truth is that God is a mystery. He really is. We know a bit, but we don't know the whole picture by a long shot. And I think we evangelicals, if I'm allowed to call myself one, we're more guilty than anybody else of being like the Pharisees and saying, well, we've got the word of God and we know exactly what God's like and how he works. And if it doesn't fit into our understanding, then it can't be from God.
But you can see it sort of comes out of, I guess that evangelical stuff comes out of a confidence that the truth has been revealed and we understand it, we've thought it through, and then you put it into action. And so you create, I suppose you create a system or a way of believing and checking that you believe. But you're saying the danger in that then is that you create blockers that stop people from entering the kingdom.
What you just described, Lucas, is exactly what the Pharisees did. And
Yeah.
that's why they fell foul of Jesus. He's trying to tell them, look, don't go to the book. Come to me. This is a living thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're still guided by that living relationship, by what we can grasp and understand from the story.
Yeah.
And in a way, you've got to grab parts of that or grab the whole of that, and you develop a relationship or a way of thinking about God, a way of thinking about Jesus, a way of thinking about his story and truth. You can't just, there's got to be some sort of response that you create, I guess, or
Yeah.
a culture that you create as a response.
Yeah. And I don't think the Pharisees were wrong in trying to please God by obeying his word. It's just that they weren't open to God revealing new stuff.
Yep.
They wanted God dead in the past, like the Sadducees, you know? And
Yep.
Jesus' answer to them is, look, God isn't the God of, I mean, turned around positively. God is the God of the living,
Yeah.
not the God of the dead. And I think that's it. We've got to be prepared to realize that our understanding, the best of our understanding, is still subject to further illumination. And that's why Jesus called himself the light of the world.
Yeah.
So
how do we not let that confidence, our confidence in that illumination that he's given us, turn into something that stops other people from coming in?
well, while I was doing my half a lap jog this morning, I was thinking precisely of that. Probably in reference to my brother. Actually, I was thinking, how would you persuade him that there are other ways of expressing our faith in Jesus than what he thinks? And it came to me, you know, with our everybody gets into clean clothes on Sunday morning and goes to church for the Baptists. And here's a sermon that kind of reinforces the life that we're living, and we try to be good and fail often, but we come back to church every Sunday morning freshly showered and scented and looking bright and kind of nice again. I think there's what I was thinking, look, is that kind of evangelicalism, and then there's the ritualistic kind. And like, I made a bit of a parody of the evangelicals, but there are beautiful souls, you know, who are there at church in the Baptist on Sunday morning and probably just looking like everybody else, except that there's a depth in them and welcome from them. They're not just, I'm on duty this morning to welcome you, so shake my hand and take one of these. You know, people who are genuinely go beyond that, you know?
Yeah.
You know,
it's exactly the same thing we've been talking about. It's with the Pharisees. It's people who might be there at a church and think, I've done, I'm a member of this church. I've done all of these things. I must be right with God. And then look down at other people who are not doing all these things.
Yeah.
And it can happen in any church.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as I was jogging, you know, that other way of life, the ritualistic response, where you've got a prayer book with all your prayers written out and beautifully expressed, a little bit on the formal side, but covering the doctrine perfectly. And you've got your timetable set up so that you do the Mass in the morning before breakfast, and then you go back and do something noon, and in the evening you have Vespers, and you live by a rule book. But there are beautiful people who have such amazing experiences out of that. Some of the best hymns that I think exist in our hymn book are hymns written by ritualists who express their faith to God in that way.
Yeah.
And so it's being prepared to accept. And actually you do, well, but then at the same time, they're also very prone to judge us if we don't do the rituals.
Yeah.
There's, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that the line doesn't go between different denominations and different ways of expressing your faith. It sort of goes horizontally between them all.
Yeah, and it's the people within all of those different sort of expressions. It's the people who connect with the heart of who God is, whether they're ritualistic or, not ritualistic, whatever. That's people who are responding to the life of God and are open to what God's doing.
Yeah. My conclusion while I was jogging and thinking these thoughts is that really the core of a Christian expression is a contemplative life, which is, you can call it whatever you like, but it's being spiritual, you know, putting, well, we try to say it in Cornerstone, let your physical life be spiritual, and your spiritual life, your natural life be spiritual, and your spiritual life be natural.
Yeah.
Enter into such a deep relationship with Jesus that he's part of, like you roll out of bed and you're just so grateful to be able to thank him for the day and for your life and to worship him. And it's not you can't think of not doing it that way. It's just so natural. This is life.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, there's a contemplative faith, a spiritual faith. And then I started to wonder, well, what levels of the contemplative life are there? Because there are some people who are, one of the divisions in sociology of religion is between an intense spirituality, which I realize I probably have, and then a kind of a fairly slack spirituality where you take God for granted. So even if you're, what I'm trying to say, you can get too familiar with God as there's an edge of mystery that remains, and it's healthy to fear God.
Is it also healthy to be comfortable with the mysteries that are there?
Better be, because I am.
Yeah.
In fact, it's a great relief to me that there are mysteries that I don't understand. I think it's the confirmation. If I could understand everything, like say Islam, it's all in the Quran, which is the way a lot of people treat the Bible, of course. I would feel uneasy if I had all the answers. I would not. I would begin to question question where I really was at if I thought I knew it all.
Yeah.
It's a great relief to admit that you don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably, we've gone over our time.
Bother. There's a lot more in that chapter.
There is. So next time we'll just come back and we'll have a look a bit more at the conversation the blind man has, or man born blind, and then his parents, and then the getting kicked out of synagogue, and then Jesus' response at the end.
Being kicked out of the synagogue, I wondered about that. I mean, I think their relation, it was, if anybody confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, they were to be kicked out of the synagogue. So their first attempt was to isolate Jesus and his followers from the rest of Israel. And that was just the first step until they could finally eliminate him. And you could see that working in the background. It seems to me. It seems like this is what these Pharisees are up to.
All right.
Pleasure.
We'll see you next week.
Enjoyed it. Yeah. See you next week. Bye.